Picture this. It's October 23, 2002. The air is thick with tension, but not where you'd expect. We're not on a battlefield. We're in the heart of Moscow, at the Dubrovka Theater. The place is buzzing, packed to the rafters with around 900 people, all eager to catch a sold-out performance of a hit musical. Little did they know, the night was about to take a dark, unimaginable turn. As the Soviet Union crumbled in '91, Chechnya saw its chance and declared independence. Russia wasn't having it. They invaded Chechnya in '94, and what followed was a brutal conflict that left the region in ruins. Fast forward to 2002, and Chechen separatists had had enough. They decided to switch gears, opting for guerrilla warfare and even targeting civilians in Russia. So, back to that. Waiting for the second act's grand spectacle, a prop plane landing on stage. But then bam! A group of masked men in camo burst onto the stage. At first, people thought it was part of the act. I mean, who wouldn't? It's a theater, right? But the illusion shattered when one of the intruders fired shots into the air. These weren't actors. They were the 29th Division of the Chechen Army. The militant leader quickly reassured the crowd, saying they had no beef with foreigners and would let anyone with a foreign passport go. Meanwhile, some quick-thinking performers backstage slipped out an open window and alerted the cops. In total, around 90 people managed to escape or find a hiding spot. Day 2, October 24th. The militants start off by releasing about 150 hostages, women, kids, and foreigners. But as the hours tick by, the situation inside the theater goes from bad to worse. The group's leader, Morbarv, lays down an ultimatum. Russian forces must leave Chechnya. No ifs, ands, or buts. They even set a one-week deadline, threatening to start taking lives if their demands weren't met. Russian forces must leave Chechnya. No ifs, ands, or buts. Hostages inside the building were in touch with their families via cell phones, and they revealed some chilling details. The militants were armed to the teeth. Grenades, mines, homemade explosives, you name it. They even had additional explosives scattered throughout the theater. The Russian government tried to negotiate. They offered the militants a ticket to any country, as long as it wasn't Russia or Chechnya, if they released all the hostages. Meanwhile, some hostages, possibly under duress, appealed to President Putin to halt the fighting in Chechnya and not to storm the building. This crisis was so intense that Putin had to cancel a planned trip overseas, which included meetings with U.S. President George W. Bush. Several embassies were scrambling to get their citizens out. The militants even said they'd release 50 Russian hostages if Ahmed Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya's pro-Moscow administration, would come to the theater. But Kadyrov ghosted them, and the release never happened. In a bizarre twist, a hot water pipe burst in the middle of the night, flooding the ground floor. The militants saw this as a provocation, while an FSB spokesperson said it was just a coincidence. But let's be real, in a situation like this, even a dripping tap could set off a powder keg. Now, you might be wondering, what was the international community doing during all this? Well, they were far from idle. Several countries were in talks to get their citizens out of the theater. The militants were playing hardball. They said they'd release 50 Russian hostages if Ahmed Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya's pro-Moscow administration, would come to the theater. But Kadyrov ghosted them, and the release never happened. It was like a high-stakes poker game where everyone was bluffing, but the stakes were human lives. And speaking of stakes, let's talk about the arsenal these militants had. This wasn't some ragtag group. They were organized and heavily armed. Hostages reported that the militants had grenades, mines, and even homemade explosive devices strapped to their bodies. They also had additional explosives placed strategically throughout the theater. It was a ticking time bomb, literally. The militants were also using Arabic names among themselves, and the female militants were dressed in Arab-style niqab clothing. This was unusual for the North Caucasus region and added another layer of complexity to the situation. It was like they were sending a message, not just to Russia but to the world. As the clock ticked down, the atmosphere inside the theater grew increasingly tense. Basic necessities like food and water were running low, and the sanitary conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The hostages were not only dealing with the fear of what might happen next, but also the physical and emotional toll of being trapped in such dire circumstances. The Russian government was in a tight spot. On one hand, they had a responsibility to protect their citizens. On the other, giving in to the militants' demands would set a dangerous precedent. It was a lose-lose situation, and the clock was ticking. President Putin was under immense pressure. He had even canceled a planned overseas trip, which would have included meetings with U.S. President George W. Bush and other world leaders. This crisis had escalated to a point where it was not just a national issue, but an international one. As the deadline approached, the Russian authorities had to make a choice. And it was a choice that would come with a heavy price, no matter the outcome. The militants had made it clear, if their demands were not met, they would start taking lives. And they had the means to do it. In a desperate move, the Russian government proposed a deal to the Chechen militants. They could leave for any country except Russia or Chechnya if they released all the hostages unharmed. It was a Hail Mary, a last-ditch effort to resolve the crisis without further loss of life. But as we all know, in situations like these, things rarely go as planned. Conversations over cell phones between the hostages and their family members revealed that the militants were growing increasingly agitated. The tension was palpable, and something had to give. In the midst of this chaos, a hot water pipe burst, flooding the ground floor of the theater. The militants saw this as a provocation, a sign that the Russian authorities were messing with them. An FSB spokesperson claimed it was a mere coincidence, but in a situation as volatile as this, even the smallest incident could have catastrophic consequences. And then, the moment of truth arrived. The deadline was up, and the world held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The world was watching, and the clock had run out. Day 3, October 25th. The militants were getting antsy. They demanded to speak with an official representative of Vladimir Putin. Outside the theater, families of the hostages were making their voices heard, staging anti-war protests in a desperate plea for the safety of their loved ones. The militants agreed to release 75 foreigners, but they wanted diplomats from those countries to be present. They also let go of 15 Russians after a chat with Putin himself. VSD Chief Nikolai Patrushev stepped in with an offer: spare the lives of the Chechens, and they'd ensure the safe release of the remaining hostages. A team of medical professionals, led by Dr. Lino Rachel. Dr. Rachel reported that, surprisingly, the militants weren't physically harming the hostages. Most of the hostages were keeping it together, with only a few showing signs of hysteria. But then, out of nowhere, a daring move. Denis Gibro, a 30-year-old hostage, made a run for it. He sprinted over the theater seats, heading straight for the female militants near a massive explosive device. Shots were fired, missing Gibro, but tragically hitting 2 other hostages. One didn't make it, and both were evacuated. Gibro was also removed, but was later found dead. Day 4, October 26th, around 5 a.m. Moscow time. Russian special forces, stationed in the theater's complex basement, were gearing up for a full-scale assault. They pumped an unidentified gas into the ventilation system, aiming to incapacitate the militants. This decision was fueled by the increasing fear among the hostages, especially after the elimination of 2 fellow captives. At first, many thought the gas was just smoke from a fire, but soon it became clear that this was no ordinary gas. It was an aerosol anesthetic, later revealed to be fentanyl-based, a pain-relieving drug 100 times more potent than morphine. Chaos erupted. Some militants, equipped with gas masks, began firing blindly. About half an hour later, the special forces stormed the building. They blasted open the main hall's doors and engaged in a fierce firefight. The gas had done its job. Many of the militants were incapacitated, but the battle wasn't over. For another 30 minutes to an hour, Russian forces continued to engage with any Chechen militants who were still awake in other parts of the building. When the dust settled, the government claimed that all the militants had been eliminated, but the cost was devastating. Rescuers began moving the bodies of the hostages out of the building, placing them in rows in the foyer and even outside the main entrance, exposed to the elements. The final toll was staggering. Possibly as many as 200 audience members lost their lives, primarily due to the narcotic gas. The security services never disclosed the exact type of gas used, adding another layer of mystery and controversy to an already complex and tragic situation. The world was left to grapple with the ethical and moral implications of the Russian government's actions. Could this tragedy have been avoided, and at what cost? This crisis wasn't just a clash of arms. It was a clash of ideologies, a test of wills, and a tragedy that left scars on a nation and the world. What is the value of a human life? And what are we willing to sacrifice to protect it? In the wake of the operation, the medical response was chaotic, to say the least. Doctors and paramedics were in the dark about the exact type of gas used, forcing them to play a dangerous guessing game when administering first aid. This lack of information had devastating consequences, resulting in permanent harm to many of the injured due to incorrect treatment. Ambulances were on standby, and even regular city buses were called in to assist. Medical personnel were prepared for injuries caused by explosions and gunfire, but a chemical substance. The Russian security forces had to justify their use of the potent gas. They argued that a swift and unanticipated attack was the only way to prevent the militants from setting off their explosives. Moscow Mayor Yuri Lushkov praised the special forces, stating that the operation was executed with great skill. He had initially hoped for a negotiated resolution, but emphasized that the final assault became necessary due to reports of hostage casualties. But here's the kicker. Even though more lives were lost at the hands of the security forces than the militants, the Russian government doubled down. They took even more stringent measures in Czechia, leading to accusations of various atrocities. And what was the Chechen response? They continued their campaign of rebel attacks on Russian soil. It was as if the theater crisis had opened a Pandora's box, unleashing a cycle of violence and retribution that seemed to have no end. So where does that leave us? With a lot of unanswered questions and moral quandaries. The Russian government's actions during the crisis have been the subject of intense scrutiny and debate. Was the use of the gas justified if it saved some lives, cost others? And what about the Chechen militants? Were their actions a desperate cry for attention to their cause, or an unforgivable act of terror? And let's not forget the hostages, the ordinary men and women who found themselves caught in this deadly game of cat and mouse. Their lives were forever changed, and many paid the ultimate price. But even for those who survived, this crisis serves as a stark reminder of the complexities and ethical dilemmas inherent in any conflict. It's not just a black and white narrative of good versus evil. It's a murky, complicated web of choices and consequences. And it raises questions that go beyond the immediate crisis. What are the long-term effects of such a traumatic event on a society? How do governments make impossible decisions in the face of life and death? And perhaps most hauntingly, how do we, as a global community, grapple with the ethical implications of such actions? So, as we reflect on this harrowing event, we're left to ponder these unsettling questions. Questions that don't have easy answers but are crucial to consider as we navigate the treacherous waters of global politics and human conflict.